The title of the talk is possibly a little bit weird. What I'm arguing is that money matters. And money matters in all sorts of ways which are perhaps not obvious. What I'm going to do today is first of all talk about economic inequality. And then I'm going to suggest that the extent of economic inequality is not inevitable, it's a matter of choice. And then in the second part of the talk, I look at the particular issue of Ireland and what I call the monetised welfare state. The Irish welfare state is very effective, oddly enough, at reducing inequality, but it does it by moving money around. And in my conclusion, I look at what policies are needed to reduce inequality, both in Ireland and within Europe. That is about protecting the existing welfare state, and then crucially, two things that I think need to be on the political agenda. Firstly, overall wage increases, particularly at the bottom of the distribution. And secondly, improved public services, in particular, universal, publicly accessible childcare. Okay, off we go. Let's talk about economic inequality. Economic inequality is about money, obviously. But in today's world, it's about the importance of money as opposed to other forms of inequality. All societies are unequal. And they're unequal in different ways. But one of the curious features of today's world, not just of capitalism, but of the sort of capitalist society we live in today, is the way in which everything is counted in monetary terms. It's intriguing. I just noticed this story in the Irish Times the other day. Terry Waite, who some people may remember, was taken as a hostage in the Lebanon. After 5 years coming out of imprisonment, he said the thing that struck him was a gradual drift and change in society towards giving everything a monetary value. At the beginning of the 1990s, he felt that the world had changed while he'd been in isolation, and that monetary values mattered far more than before. So it's not just about inequality, it's about a particular form of inequality. And the particular form of inequality that we face today has only very, very recently come on the political agenda. Because let's be honest, in the last 30 years, in the developed world, the progressive forces have actually not thought very much about economic inequality, being concerned with identity issues, with community politics, but not with the nuts and bolts of economic inequality. And it's only very, very recently that people on the left have actually started looking at and taking to pieces the economic chasms that have been opening up in front of their eyes. And the first thing I want to put on the agenda is the very simple fact, and Mike has already alluded to this, and I'm going to be saying a lot of things that really just repeat what Mike said to you, that economic inequality is a matter to a very large extent of choice. We're often told it's inevitable. You can't have a successful economy unless you have economic inequality or something like that. But let's be clear, economic inequality varies. First of all, it varies over time. In most countries, of course, inequality has been rising. As Mike's already indicated, it's not a straightforward thing. There are bumps and bangs, and it's not happened absolutely everywhere. But if you look down the columns on the chart in front of you, you will see that overall economic inequality has been rising. These are, of course, our friends' Genie coefficients. Furthermore, and again, Mike has already pointed this out, economic inequality varies between countries. So if you take any one point in time, some countries are more unequal than others. Again, as Mike has already said, look at the right-hand corner of the chart, the USA. The USA is the outlier. The USA, amongst developed countries, is by far the most unequal, and has been for some time. So when people, and this is particularly the case in Ireland, enthuse about the American model, please remind them that if they want to be like America, they are saying they want to be like a society which has levels of inequality and levels of deprivation that no European country would tolerate. So why does inequality matter? Maybe it's fine. There are, I think, some rather different arguments about inequality and why we should do something about it. There is, if you like, a rather technical argument about economic growth. The economists love this one. Suddenly, economists have started saying too much inequality reduces or even prevents economic growth. And Özlem is going to be talking to you about this later this morning. But please notice, although I think this argument is true, it is an empirical argument which we could falsify. It might actually be the case that economic growth does depend on more economic inequality. And, if that is the case, do we just abandon the argument? Also, the argument about the connection between inequality and slow growth assumes that we want the existing form of growth. Well, there are a few people from the Green Party in the room, and TASC has tended to ignore, like most people on the Irish left, the fact that the sort of economic growth that we've had is an ecological disaster. So do we really want more growth of the sort that we've had? I question that. There's also a rather different argument that sociologists like me like, which is that economic inequality, or too much economic inequality, undermines social cohesion. One of those sort of gooey words, but you can translate it as trust and liking each other. Economic inequality means that society gets unpleasant. This is the argument that the spirit level, Wilkinson and Pickett's famous book, produces. So that if you have too much economic inequality, crime goes up, people don't trust each other, etc., etc. Again, notice that's an empirical argument. It might actually not be the case, and there's quite a lot of evidence that says it's not true, or it's dodgy, or whatever. So that argument might be wrong. And if it is, do we abandon the argument that we want more economic equality? I don't think so, because I think at the end of the day, there's a moral argument. A good society requires that there is some equality of power, esteem, and worth amongst its members. And it's impossible to imagine that if there are extremes of economic inequality. So I think we should be talking about economic inequality. I think we should be concerned about it. But what's new about the world in which we live today? Well, I think there are two things. One, Mike has already flagged up to you, which is the importance of wealth as opposed to income. And in particular, not just wealth, but I'm sorry to use all these long words, but Rory's going to use them too, incidentally, commodified and financialized wealth. That is to say, wealth where you can change its form. I've got a house, I can sell it, I can buy shares, I can buy life pensions, I can split it up into bits and pieces. I can use it to raise money. I've got a house, I go to the bank and I say, please lend me another $1 million because I want to gamble it. And they say, yeah, well, we'll take the house, fine. Oh, yeah. So it's commodified and financialized. It's very different to the sort of, if you like, for example, aristocratic wealth, the landed estate passed down from generation to generation, or, interestingly, the small farm or the family shop, which is ours, and it's always going to be ours, and it's important to us. We only say it in a complete emergency. The wealth that we're dealing with today is much more fluid, much more flexible, can be chopped up into bits and pieces in the way that traditional wealth usually hasn't been. And this wealth has two forms, which I think are important. First of all, there's the importance of what I call light wealth. The simple fact that the midpoint person in any European society actually has property. The median household wealth in the Eurozone, last figures, are just over 100K. Think about that. The midpoint person in Europe has 100,000. And most of that is, I might point this out, housing wealth. But not all of it. And of course, as you go up, the other sorts of wealth increase. But ordinary people usually own cars, which interestingly are financialized commodified because you borrow to get them and all that sort of stuff. Some people own shares. The Financial Times got very excited about 15 years ago when the number of shareholders in Germany was bigger for the first time than the number of trade union members. The number of trade union members has gone down subsequently. People own life insurance, etc., etc. So ordinary people, not everybody by a long way, but ordinary people own stuff. Dark side. It's not just more wealth, it's more debt. As you go down, the level of debt increases. Poor people used to be people who just had very little income and no property. When I was a student, where Mike works at the LSE, we were always taught, well, the point about income distribution is that everybody has some income, but the point about wealth distribution is that some people have nothing. It's not like that any longer. A lot of people are negative. So light wealth means lots and lots of people with property. And as you go down the scale, more and more people with really substantial debts. We're not talking about a few bob. We're talking about really, really substantial debts. That's the first of the first new things. The second of the first new things is the importance of heavy wealth. Mike has already pointed this out. We live in a world where there are significant numbers of extraordinarily rich people. This is not just about somebody who has a flashy car and a couple of houses. These are people with substantial assets, substantial income, such that they can buy power. In 1987, according to Forbes, there were precisely $140 billionaires in the world. In 2017, the last one, there were 2,043, the new global super rich. And these are the real citizens of nowhere because they can move around. They are not interested any longer in the societies in which they are nominally based. It's interesting to compare these people with, if you like, the traditional very rich. Think, for example, of the Wallenberg family in Sweden. It used to be pointed out that the bizarre fact that Sweden is social democracy, actually one family owned about a quarter of the country. But the Wallenbergs came from Sweden. They were identified with Sweden. They felt a responsibility to Swedish society. The global rich today have no connection with individual societies. In tax terms, but also in political terms and emotional terms. They are the citizens of nowhere. The second thing that's new is the occupational structure itself has been changing. In the 1950s, developed societies like Ireland, like the UK, like the USA, like European societies, in a way, I mean, I'm simplifying wildly, of course, but you could think of them as pyramids. Lots of people at the bottom, and as you went up, fewer and fewer people. And then in the sort of high point of social democracy, we get societies that are essentially like this. They're big in the middle, lots and lots of people with sort of average incomes. There are a few rich people at the top, and there are a few people we worry about at the bottom. But there's been growth in the middle. And this, incidentally, produces lots and lots of social mobility. People rising up from the bottom, the first kid in the street who went to university, the first kid in the street who got a white-collar job. That's not because they were particularly energetic or clever, the way right-wing commentators explain these things. It's simply because the middle was expanding. More room. But those days were those days. Arguably, and again, I'm wildly simplifying, and there's lots and lots of debate about this, but people are talking, sociologists and economists are talking about hourglass societies, societies which are getting squeezed in the middle, and they have a big group at the top, at the sort of middle top, and a big group at the bottom. What's been happening, it seems, is something like this. First of all, there's been a growth of low-wage, insecure jobs at the bottom. There are lots of ways of seeing this. The favorite way that sociologists use is think how you get your car cleaned, assuming you've got enough income to have one. 20 years ago, you took your car to the car wash, right? Ran it through, and the machine did it. But now, those car washes are still there, but when I go to park my car, it's not exactly flashy, but it is still just functioning, in Tesco's in a middle-class suburb of Dublin, I don't get it cleaned in a machine. There are 3 people valeting it. Sales of lawnmowers in the United States have gone through the floor in the last decade. Because people don't mow their lawns any longer, they get teams of Hispanic, probably illegal immigrants, to mow their lawns for them. Right? The low-wage jobs are growing. So that pushes out the bottom. The next thing that's been happening is the squeezing of the middle. And at TASC, we've been doing quite a lot of work on what's been happening to working conditions. And one of the things that we keep finding is that jobs that used to be, if you like, steady, real jobs have been turned into jobs that are casualized and temporary and precarious. So there's a lot of downwards pressure. Think of all those jobs that people start now, and they're told, well, it's not going to be like people who started 30 years ago, right? Teaching, for example, right? It's all going to be changed. It's different. It's going to be modern. It's casualized. And there has been growth at the top. The top somewhere around, we're not talking about the 1%, we're talking somewhere around the 10%, so the income distribution to people, corporate lawyers, professionals, the new accountants, all these sorts of people. These jobs seem to be growing. So the world is changing. Well, that's a general characterization. What about Ireland? I think I'm about halfway through. Well, there are a lot of people in Ireland who managed to read some of the first work that we in TASC did on inequality, and they said, well, yeah, that shows that Ireland is the most unequal society in Europe. The Irish Times ran a headline to that effect 2 years ago. I don't know whether the person from the Irish Times is here today. They have been, but I want them to listen very carefully, because that is absolute rubbish. Ireland is not the most unequal society in Europe. And furthermore, although people think there are many measures inequality in Ireland is increasing, actually, it's not. The question is, why isn't it? And that's what I want to talk about now. First of all, let's be clear that this society is a relatively affluent society. A lot of talk about economic inequality is relative. You know, we compare, for example, we look at Genie coefficients, we look at things like poverty rates, and these sorts of things depend on placing people relative to everybody else in the society. So I think it's quite useful to get down to, if you like, nuts and bolts, the real situations. And one useful way of doing that is to look at what the Eurostat terms severe material deprivation. There's a sort of list of basic necessities, things that we think people ought to have, things like being able to buy a new pair of shoes, being able to heat the house. And to what extent are people forced to go without those things? Eurostat has a measure of severe material deprivation, doing without at least 4 of those 9 necessities. And if you look at the chart, you will see that Ireland is sort of in the middle. There are societies like Sweden and Finland on the left of your chart, where virtually nobody goes without those things. There are equally societies at the right end of your chart, look in particular at the third one along at the end, Greece, where people clearly, lots more people do without those things. And Ireland's in the middle. A significant number of people, let us not be trivial about this, 8% of the Irish population go without at least 4 of 9 necessities. But that is a lot better than some other countries. Interestingly, look at the pattern of change. In most countries in Europe, not all, in most countries, deprivation rose after the crisis and is now going down again. In some countries like Poland, for example, the story is completely the opposite. Deprivation has been falling quite dramatically. In a few countries, and Greece is the one that sticks out like a sore thumb here, deprivation has been rising. Things are getting worse and worse and worse. And we're not talking relatively, we're talking absolutely. More and more people can't afford basic necessities. But in Ireland, it's been getting a little bit better. A little bit. Let's not get too excited. Ireland's a relatively affluent country. Real poverty is not as bad as elsewhere, as some other countries. It's a lot worse than some other countries, obviously. The key point I want to make is the importance of the welfare state. Let's look at our friend, the Genie Coefficient. I bet there's nobody in the room who could calculate the Genie Coefficient, but I think everybody in the room knows roughly what it is. This is a measure of inequality. Don't worry, I couldn't do it either. And first of all, let's look at people's disposable income before taxes and before transfers. And this is the one that the Irish Times managed to get hold of. Because here we are, the worst in Europe, the most unequal society, right? A Gini coefficient, 2015 is the latest one we have, before taxes, before transfers, is the worst in Europe. Terrible. Appalling. But listen what I said, before taxes and before transfers. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know my gross income, actually. What I know is how much money I've got every month, right? It's, in the report, I say it's a bit like people saying, well, of course, Ireland's sunnier than Spain, which is true. Yeah, we actually have more hours in which there is sunshine. The only trouble is we have a lot of clouds here, and they get in the way. You know, so when people say Ireland's the most unequal society in Europe, they're talking absolute rubbish, unless you believe that Ireland is also the sunniest country in Europe. Because this is what really matters. This is what happens to people's income after taxes, after transfers. And then, if you look at Ireland now, you see that it's not quite the most equal society in Europe, but it's got a lot more equal. It's sort of boringly in the middle, right? So Ireland is, I'm afraid, a very boring country. It's not the most unequal society in Europe because the state moves money around. And this is the moment I was frightened of. We might have a technical problem. Hold on. This thing is... we're okay. Okay. We're off again. And this, oddly enough, was particularly clear in the first years of the crisis. The grey lines on the chart show you the growth in percentage points in inequality between 2007 and 2010 in in market income inequality. This is before taxes. And as you would expect, what happens when the crisis hits in Ireland, as we all know, this really was the worst in Europe. Wham! The income that people are receiving gets a lot more unequal. But that's before taxes and before transfers. If you actually look at what people end up with in their bank accounts or in cash, actually, Ireland got just a little bit more equal in those terms in those 3 years. The green line looks at what happened to disposable income inequality. And you will see that in some countries, the green line is to the right of the vertical line. So there are some countries over here where it's... I'm going to look at these things here. Here we go. Oh, no, forget it. Okay, there are some countries anyway, the green line's to the right, and that shows you growth, and there are other ones where it moves the other way. Okay, so what happens in Ireland? First thing that happens in Ireland is that we have to face the fact that we have a low employment rate. Even during the boom, we never hit the target of full employment. We imported lots of labour, but actually a hell of a lot of people not working for various reasons. A lot of people in Ireland are not at work, even when the economy is quite full. We have the highest proportion of low work intensity households, and appallingly, we have the highest proportion of the age group 50 and 19 not in employment, educational training. We have one of the highest NEET rates in Europe. Crucially, we have a lot of low pay. These charts, and you can look at them in the report, show that Ireland is one of the countries with the highest rates of low pay in Europe. Despite that, the proportion of people in poverty is, as I say, about in the middle. And actually, we have an astonishingly low rate of in-work poverty. It's low because of transfers. So what happens is this. First of all, and this is my last chart. First of all, the bars show you the proportion of people who are at risk of poverty, who are also suffering from material deprivation. And the point of the story is simply to say, first of all, as you'd imagine, it starts going up with the crisis. It then stabilizes and comes down a little bit, but not much. So if you're below the 60% of the median income, which is the poverty line, it's not just a relative thing. You're suffering from material deprivation, and that doesn't seem to be shifting. The blue line shows you the people to whom those bars refer. That's the number of people at risk of poverty. And again, it's just pottering along. It's going down a little bit now, actually. All the indications are it's going down a little bit, but it's not going down very much. And that is the real deprivation rate overall in the society. And again, you can see that is going down now quite significantly. So with economic recovery, with growing employment, yes, actually fewer people are suffering from real deprivation. But, and this is the big, big but, at the bottom of the society, there's a significant number of people who are not gaining anything at all. On some indications, it's actually getting worse. And that means there's a new form of inequality developing. Last slide. What's to be done? First, absolutely fundamental point. Europe is not America. Mike's already stressed this. Without the welfare state doing the sort of things that the Irish state does, and lots of other things as well, Ireland and other European countries would be as unequal as the USA. So it's because of the national welfare states of Europe that our societies are not like the USA. Notice in brackets, unless the European Union develops something that looks like a union social policy, I think we can write off the European project. Look what happened in Brexit. Precisely the people who are suffering most from economic change were the people who voted for Brexit. There's a nice correlation between the amount of European regional aid any area got and the Brexit vote. That just tells you what's been going on. The European Union is not identified with progressive social policies. It's not identified with protecting people against the market, as national states are. It's identified with exposing people to the market. And since there is very little sign of that reversing, I think we can probably kiss goodbye to the European project, unfortunately. But looking more specifically at Ireland, in Europe, we need to stop just thinking about the level of welfare benefits when we talk about poverty and inequality. We need to talk about the level of wages. The point is that at the bottom and towards the bottom, people simply do not have enough money, and these need to be pushed up. Second thing, why do you need money? Why does money matter so much? And Mike alluded to this. Why capital starts becoming more important. If you have bad social services, if your health depends, like it does in this country, on buying it, then money is going to matter more. If your education, if your health, if your childcare is something that the state, for which you have to pay through taxes, NB, provides to everybody as a right, wealth actually matters rather less. So the next big thing, if we are serious about tackling economic inequality, is we need social investment. And there's one place where social investment really pays off very quickly. It's called childcare. Publicly accessible, universal childcare systems make an economic contribution in all sorts of ways, but crucially they facilitate people to get work and push up the bottom of the income distribution. So 2 takeaways, 2 slogans. We need a pay rise and we need proper universal childcare. Thanks.